All welcome to the Pourdavoud Institute. Allow me to welcome you all to the Pourdavoud Institute for the first lecture of this academic year. It gives me great pleasure to start this fall's Pourdavoud lecture series with a contribution by my esteemed colleague, Dr. Lucinda Dirven, professor of ancient religions at the University of Nijmegen, or as we know it from the Roman period, Novio Magus, in the Netherlands, who fortunately for us is presently a Getty Scholar at the Villa. As usual, I would like to seize this opportunity to thank our colleagues at the Getty for graciously facilitating these academic exchanges between the two institutions. Professor Dirven's research encompasses interactions between the Roman world and the Arsacid Parthian Near East, with a focus on borderlands and cosmopolitan intermediaries such as Dura, Hatra, Palmyra, whose influence on the Roman West she seeks to capture. One particular line of inquiry in her research, which is distinguished by its capaciousness and her ability simultaneously to command of a varied material culture and equally diverse textual testimonies, is the res religiosa, or the continuity and transformation of religious practices on the Parthians. I'm sorry, I think I missed a line. And that would be the continuity and transformation of religious practices in Mesopotamia and Syria under Arsacid dominion. So I got it right this time. I must confess that to specialize on the Parthians, the so-called parents pauvres of ancient Iranian studies, itself an arcane, boutique enterprise, exhibits great fortitude. But to go even beyond by focusing on religious practices in the Arsacid Empire and the question of Zoroastrianism therein shows great courage and elicits my unconditional admiration. I may further add that we have the right audience for Professor Dirven's talk here at UCLA, as we may boast having a few specialists in Parthian studies ourselves, among them my brilliant colleague, Professor Lara Fabian, and Professor Moussavi. Professor Dirven's publications obviously reflect her wide research interests, from her excellent monograph on the Palmyrans of Dura Europos, published with Brill in 1999, if I'm correct, to more recent studies, such as Religion in Hatra and the Creation of a Local Parthian Identity, published in 2022, and one of my favorite studies of hers, the Astronomical Diaries and Religion in Seleucid and Parthian Babylon, the Case of the Prophet Nanaya, published in 2019. From all of this, we may adduce the extraordinary versatility of Professor Dirven's scholarship. Her work today promises to be thought-provoking. Hitherto, no doubt owing to the paucity of our documentation on the state of affairs in the Arsacid realm, and opinions being still not settled as to what type of polity it represented, ranging from a disciplined, centralized state, at this in the early centuries of its existence, to which I personally subscribe, to a loose confederacy in the latter centuries, prior to the rise of the Neo-Persian Sasanians, no doubt due to the divergence of opinions on the very nature of Parthian power, its religious landscape is equally subject to a variety of interpretations. Whereas much has been written on the fragmented and variegated religious landscape of the Arsacid world, in this espousing our traditional discernment of its political constitution, few have attempted to identify the religious preferences of the Arsacid rulers and explore whether their practices could be interpreted in light of what we know from ancient Mazdaism or later Sasanian Zoroastrianism, which could suggest the presence of Mazdean Zoroastrian ideas in the ideological framework of the Arsacid King of Kings. It is precisely this later perspective that Dr. Dirven has embraced and shall be lecturing on in your presence today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Dirven. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for this very kind introduction. And indeed, as you have made clear, this is quite a bold undertaking, especially as a non-Iranist. what I am, because I only work on the edges of the Parthian world. So thank you so much for inviting me here. I'm very happy to be here, but also a bit nervous for that reason. And the reason I'm standing here is that I was asked by my good friend Albert de Jong to write the chapter on Zoroastrianism in the Parthian Empire for a volume he is editing together with Sarah Stewart and Jenny Rose. And that will be published in the Routledge World series, The Zoroastrian World, and it's about to appear in next March. So actually you are the first to, that I present this research to. And it has to be noted that in compiling this, work, they asked the most unlikely people to write for them because they wanted to do something else. So please be warned. Well, the Arsacid, or the Parthian Empire, which started with Arsacid I in the former Achaemenid and Seleucid province of Parthia in 248 before the Common Era, existed for nearly 5 centuries and is the longest lasting of the pre-Islamic Iranian empires. From its modest beginnings in the northeast of present-day Iran, the Arsacid Empire developed into a huge, ethnically and culturally diverse empire that stretched from India to the Euphrates. The big transformation occurred when the reign of Mithridates I, who reigned from 171 to 132 before the Common Era, and who conquered the remaining Iranian plateau and Mesopotamia with the densely populated cities. Even though the Arsacid Empire was the most influential actor in the Near East, in Near Eastern politics for more than 3 centuries, it is the least known of the pre-Islamic Iranian empires. And this lack of understanding holds true for almost all aspects of this Iranian dynasty. And religion, the topic of my talk today, is no exception. As with other cultural, political, and social facets of Arsacid rule, our ignorance on the religious preferences of the Arsacids and that of their subjects is due largely to a lack of evidence. Exceedingly little is known about the religious preferences of the Arsacid rulers themselves, whereas our knowledge of the religious situation in their vast empire is not only sparse, but also unevenly spread and varied in character. The most spectacular archaeological evidence comes from the periphery, or just outside the empire, from places such as Hatra, Duriropos, Palmyra in the west, and the Kushan Empire in the east. Inscriptions and other finds show that religious practices in the west were predominantly, but not exclusively, Semitic in character, whereas in the east, Zoroastrian influences were strong, often combined with other local traditions like Buddhism. The associated kingdom of Armenia has hardly yielded archaeological remains, but here later Christian literary sources point to strong Zoroastrian influences combined with West Semitic elements. Information on religion in Mesopotamia during the Parthian period is meager, but what little we do have shows that it was very much a continuation of the Seleucid period and remarkably diverse. Many religious traditions left their mark, so we have Babylonian, Aramaic, Arab, Jewish, Christian, Manichaean, but traces of Iranian religion are strikingly sparse. In contrast, graffiti and coins from the province of Persis, the former heartland of the Achaemenid dynasty, show that many Achaemenid traditions survived well into the Hellenistic and Parthian periods. The religious situation in the rest of Iran is far more difficult to pin down. In Elimais, several sanctuaries were found, especially on hilltops, but the Iranian or Zoroastrian nature of these structures is difficult to establish and perhaps unlikely. In the past, scholars have tried to supplement missing information on the Arsacid court by looking for common features in the periphery, assuming that such similarities must derive from a common political and cultural center. And I think primarily, of course, of the work of Mikhail Rostovtsev, here photographed together with Frans Kumel in the newly discovered Mithraeum on Dura Europos in 1934. We now think that such an approach is methodologically unsound in light of the ethnic, cultural, and religious diversity that characterized this huge empire. In current research, the idea of Parthian culture or religion emanating from the Arsacid court has therefore mainly been abandoned. Most historians now opt for many regional or local cultures, each with their own cultural, artistic, and religious identity that had nothing to do with the political center. In this lecture, I shall argue that this recent regional approach throws out the baby with the bathwater. There can be no doubt that the Parthian Empire was a multi-ethnic state, characterized by a great regional variety. But following Albert de Jong, I argue that we also have to reckon with a centralizing force. And to understand this dynamism, we should start by studying the evidence from the center, sparse as that may be. So first Nisa and Hekatompilos, and later Seleucia on the Tigris. Crucial to a proper understanding of the overarching principle within the Arsacid Empire is its political organization. Although the political and administrative structure of the empire are insufficiently understood, it's clear that contrary to the Achaemenid and Sasanian empires, the Arsacid Empire was not a centralized state. Instead, the Arsacid kings governed over the heartland, the Iranian plateau and Mesopotamia, whereas rulers who were associated with or belonged to the royal house governed in adjacent territories. The King of Kings delegated his power to his associates and provided them with the right to rule. And although the exact nature of the relationship between the center and the periphery is not entirely clear and probably fluctuated over time, most historians now think the King of Kings mostly had a firm grip on these Parthian provinces and vassal kingdoms. In view of the political dependency of these local elites upon the King of Kings, it's only logical to assume that they express their alliance in cultural terms as well. And the evidence indeed suggests that Parthian culture spread through the network of Parthian families and their estates and cities and resulted in a Parthian commonwealth. De Jong has pointed out that throughout the non-Iranian territories, one can find Iranian influences in the use of the administrative titles, Iranian loanwords, and personal names, as well as clothing and weaponry. I recently argued that Arsacid influence can also be discerned in the figurative and decorative arts, not as a specific style, as was argued previously by Rostovtsev, but in terms of iconographic motifs that the periphery copied from the center. And most of these motifs are symbols of kingship, but we should not forget topics illustrating activities that are closely related to the court, such as banqueting, hunting, and warfare. Such influences are to be found primarily among the local rulers, suggesting that these local courts modeled themselves upon the court of the King of Kings. The religious influence the Arsacids exercised upon their subjects remains the great unknown. It has been argued that religious influence was non-existent, because unlike the Achaemenids and the Sasanians, the Arsacids did not use their religion as an instrument of imperial rule. Supposedly, Arsacid religion was mainly practiced in terms of a family tradition. In light of the profound political and cultural influence that the Arsacid court exerted on the local courts, I think this is highly unlikely. The main problem is that very little is known about their religion in the first place. Paramount in the discussion on the religion of the Arsacids so far has been the question whether the Arsacids were Zoroastrians or not. And this debate is due to the scarcity of the sources and ultimately reverts to the discussion how Zoroastrianism should be defined. To linger upon this question for too long does not contribute much to a better understanding of Arsacid religious practices. But since it has been paramount in discussion so far, the issue cannot be ignored, and I shall therefore return to this question of definition at the end of my talk. In what follows, I shall start by summarizing what we know about the religion of the Arsacids, and I shall argue that although their religious behavior differed from the Achaemenids and Sasanians, the ideology of Arsacid kingship was equally developed from Zoroastrian notions. Then I turn to a discussion of the religious practices of families and rulers that reigned under their suzerainty, arguing the Arsacids influenced their ideology of kingship as well. And I conclude with the topic that we know least about, the way such practices influenced the religious lives of the populace. So I start with religion at the Arsacid court. Stray notices in classical writers show that outsiders thought of the Arsacid religion as standing in the Persian tradition. Unfortunately, there's no religious literary sources from the Arsacid Empire itself that have come down to us that confirm this view. This lack of literary sources is easily explained by the fact that Zoroastrian sacred texts were transmitted orally until the late Sasanian period. More disturbing is the fact that monumental public inscriptions or sculptures with a religious connotation, comparable to those of the Achaemenid king Darius or the Sasanian king Shapur, for example, are also unknown. Never, not even on Arsacid coins, do we find a reference to Ahura Mazda or other Iranian deities to support or explain Arsacid rule. The only gods that are occasionally depicted look like Greek gods. Fire altars, a popular subject on Sasanian coins, do not figure on the coins of the Arsacids either. Together with the fact that the Arsacids are known to have preferred Greek culture, they wrote Greek, they labeled themselves Philhellène on their coins, and at first they showed a preference for Greek style and iconography in the figurative arts. So the conclusion of many modern historians has been that the Arsacids were not proper Iranians, let alone Zoroastrians. This impression is confirmed by Middle Persian texts, which describe the restoration of the good religion under the Sasanians after a period of neglect, following the rule of the Greeks and the Parthians. The Sasanians are largely responsible for the negative appreciation of the Arsacid Empire in general and Arsacid religion in particular. In contrast to their own rule, the reign of the Arsacids is portrayed as a period of religious fragmentation, idol worship, and neglect of Zoroastrian ideals. They're probably also to blame for the destruction and disappearance of many Arsacid religious structures. However, other sources confirm the claim of classical authors and show the Arsacids standing in the Zoroastrian tradition. Particularly relevant is the material from Nisa or Mithridatkert in present-day Turkmenistan, the royal city that was founded by the first king with his name Mithridates I. The about 2,500 ostraka that have been found here contain good Iranian names that are frequently composed with the names of Iranian deities. They refer to priests bearing the Western Iranian title Magus, as well as the title Atashpat, if I pronounce that correctly, which means master of fire. The latter suggests that the sacred fire, one of the most important features of Zoroastrianism, as we know it, was worshipped at Nisa. In addition, mention is made of a temple dedicated to Nana, a Mesopotamian goddess who was very popular among followers of Zoroaster. It shows that the Achaemenid innovation to dedicate temples to certain deities continued under the Arsacids. In Nisa, there are numerous traces of royal ancestor cult, fravashis in Zoroastrian terms. According to Isidore of Charax, it was the royal necropolis of the Arsacid kings, but so far tombs have not been found. Antonio Invernizzi has argued that the so-called Round Hall, one of the buildings in Old Nisa, served in this dynastic cult. Several fragments of larger-than-life-size clay statues were found here, together with a fragmentary bust that could be identified as Mithridates I. Clearly, the idea of belonging to a dynasty was crucial to the self-definition of the Arsacids. And this is best illustrated by the fact that all subsequent rulers were called Arsacids on their coins, in imitation of the founder of the dynasty. Starting with Arsaces, a representation of a seated bowman is habitually represented on the reverse of Parthian tetradrachms. Irrespective of the much debated origin of this motif, it undoubtedly expresses the divine status of the founder of the Arsacid dynasty. The Master of Fire, mentioned in the Nisa Ostraka, perhaps tended a royal fire, a well-known class of sacred fires in Zoroastrianism. According to Isidore of Charax, such a royal fire was guarded at Assak in Astauini to commemorate the site where Arsacid I was proclaimed king. Unfortunately, this sanctuary has not been located. Probably the custom of the regal fire derived from the well-attested example of a householder's fire that was lit for every man in its own home. The royal fire is first attested in the Achaemenid period. It may be inferred from the account of Diodorus Siculus that a sacred fire was lit upon the accession of the Achaemenid king and was extinguished at his funeral. Subsequently, a new fire was lit for his successor. No architectural remains of this cult have been found, suggesting these fires were not yet worshipped in separate buildings during the Achaemenid period. Isidore's remarks strongly suggest that this changed in the Parthian period. Since dynastic fires are known to have been adopted by vassal kings of the Arsacids and were popular with the Sasanians when the cult of the royal fire was centralized and fully developed, such a hypothesis is indeed plausible. If true, this contradicts the supposedly private nature of Arsacid dynastic cult, since both text and remains suggest that such fires were housed in public places. Both Diodorus Siculus and Isidore of Charax connect the regal fire to the coronation of the king, a tradition that is still to be found among the Sasanians. Diodorus' account furthermore suggests that such a fire was inextricably linked with the king's fortune, and this in turn is possibly related to the Zoroastrian concept of the royal chwara, the divine grace or luminous fluid that is thought to surround the king and to descend upon him during his coronation. Now, chwara is a complex concept. Already present in the Avesta, it may either be used as a noun that refers to a visible, luminous quality associated with gods or worldly leaders that is usually translated glory, or as a personified, abstract divinity. In the Avesta, it is not a permanent quality. Well known is the story of Yima, the last of the legendary kings, who lost his chwara because of his hubris and impiety. In Greek and Latin sources, chwara is either translated taiki, doxa, daimon, or fortuna, and in Aramaic it is rendered as gade. According to Greek sources, the royal chwara was revered by the Persians as the heavenly concept of the living king. Plutarch recounts that guests at a royal banquet during the reign of Artaxerxes were invited to revere the royal daimon, while Athenaeus reports that the daily making of such offerings were part of Persian court protocol. Philostratus, writing about the Parthian period, tells that people entering a city must kiss a golden statue of the Parthian king, and subjects of the Sasanian kings continued to swear by the fortune of the King of Kings. In this context, Syriac sources refer to the Gade de Malek Malka, the god or fortune of the King of Kings. In addition to these classical references and the finds from Nisa, Heroic tales preserved in Arabic and Persian sources provide important additional information on the religion of the Arsacids and undoubtedly prove that they were Zoroastrians. Of special note are certain passages in the Shahnameh, Ferdowsi's national Iranian epic, written at the beginning of the 11th century, using sources that were much older. Although Ferdowsi glosses over the Arsacids, saying that their rule was short and their deeds insignificant, it is now generally accepted that large parts of the Shahnameh are in fact of Parthian origin and were at first transmitted orally. This holds true for much of the so-called Kayanian history, figuring heroic knights who were mostly modeled after the ancestors of great aristocratic Parthian families that remained their importance during the Sasanian period. In these poems, which Ghosans originally performed at the Parthian courts, the Parthian knights are associated with Avestan heroes, thus satisfying both their patrons' pride of lineage and their Zoroastrian piety. It's noteworthy that the concept of Khwara looms large in the stories of the Shahnameh. Compliant with the Avesta, it is not a permanent quality, and it may accompany kings and heroes alike. The Shahnameh suggests that Khwara was an important concept in the Arsacid period that was closely related to the dynastic cult. It's remarkable that the concept is not attested during the reign of the first 6 Sasanian rulers. As is well known, the first Sasanian rulers vehemently opposed the religious practices of their predecessors, therewith suggesting the concept was important among the Arsacids. In Sasanian times, Khwara is first attested in the Paikuli inscription of King Naseh, dated to 293, a text that testifies to the survival of Parthian traditions. So, the recurrence of the concept of Khwara at the end of the 3rd century probably was a revival and reinterpretation of the Parthian concept, instead of a sign of Zoroastrianization, as was suggested in the past. Tyche is the Greek counterpart of Iranian Khwara, and it's plausible that the goddess Tyche in fact personifies Khwara on Arsacid coinage from the reign of Phraates III onwards. At this time, the former dynastic symbol of the royal archer is replaced on tetradrachms by a representation of the living ruler receiving the diadem of kingship from a Tyche figure. Since the seated archer has dynastic connotations, it is very likely that this holds true for this new motif as well. The iconography, of course, resembles that of Ahura Mazda, offering the diadem of kingship to the Sasanian rulers in rock reliefs, and probably has the same meaning. If this interpretation is correct, it strongly suggests the idea of Khwara was replaced by Ahura Mazda, providing the worldly king with the right to rule over Iran. Contrary to Khwara, which could also be attached to other rulers and heroes, the connection with Ahura Mazda was confined to the king, and the king alone. This change is in line with the political and religious reformation the first Sasanian rulers aimed to accomplish. It is noteworthy that the ideal of a centralized, divinely sanctioned kingship originated in ancient Mesopotamia, whereas the less absolutist tradition of Khwara is of Iranian origin. So now that we've discussed the Zoroastrian character of at least kingship, let us turn to the religious influence of Arsacid rulers on their vassal kings. Recently, Matthew McCanepa convincingly argued that the dynastic cult of the Arsacids clearly inspired dynastic cults that can be found among their vassal kings and allies all over the Parthian Commonwealth and beyond. Neither of these cults was an exact copy of Arsacid practices, since such practices were frequently incorporated into non-Iranian regional traditions, or were to a greater or lesser extent merged with contemporary Hellenistic traditions. But what they have in common is that sovereigns, their relatives and ancestors, are honored in conjunction with gods that are particularly important to both the dynasty and the kingdom as a whole. Examples may be found in Shami, in the southwest of Iran, in the well-known monument of Antiochus I on Nemrudda in Comagene, in Hatra in North Iraq, and in the Rabatak inscription and dynastic shrine in Surkotal erected by the Kushan king Kanishka the Great, as well as monuments from Pontus and Armenia that are only known from literary sources and of much later date. Now, could this be called religious influence? I would like to argue that it can. True enough, these dynastic complexes differed greatly amongst themselves, and not all cultures where they have been attested are Zoroastrian. But even in a predominantly Semitic milieu like Hatra, Iranian ideas became integrated with local beliefs. In fact, all these instances are examples of religious hybridity, a phenomenon that is well attested in the Roman Empire. The foundation of all this seems to have been the notion that the Parthian king extends the right to rule to his vassals and family members. This can be expressed in representations of the King of Kings handing over the diadem of sovereignty to his substitute, as in this relief from Susa, where the last Parthian king, Artaban IV, is handing the ring to Kwasak, the satrap of Susa. The King of Kings also gave them the right to establish their own royal fires. Information about such dynastic fires comes from a letter that Tanzar, high priest of Ardashir I, wrote in reaction to a letter written by a local Parthian king named Kushnabs, a former vassal king of the Parthian King of Kings. Kushnabs accuses Ardashir of having extinguished many dynastic fires of former Parthian vassal kings. And I quote from the translation of Mary Boyce. Next for what you said, that the King of Kings has taken away fires from the fire temples, extinguished them and blotted them out, and that no one has ever before presumed so far against religion, know that the case is not so grievous, but has been wrongly reported to you. The truth is that after Darius, each of the kings of the peoples built his own fire temple, and this was pure innovation, introduced by them without the authority of the kings of old. The King of Kings has raised the temples and has confiscated the endowments and had the fires carried back to their place of origin. End of quote. It's plausible that the so-called square building in Hatra, here in the ground plan at the back of the Great Iwans, presents us with the architectural remains of such a royal fire temple. Interestingly, one of the Aramaic inscriptions found in this city mentions the god of the king, that is with the gods, and that is commemorated during his or its anniversary. This matches remarkably well with the Iranian concept of Khwara, that was so closely related to royal fires. Fire temples of vassal kings and minor rulers threatened the effort of the first Sasanian rulers to unify the Iranian people under one God-chosen king. The Sasanians had been the hereditary guardians of an important dynastic shrine in Fars, and they no doubt knew that dynastic cults were not only cherished by members of the dynasties, but were also cherished by the local population. Similar information is provided by the Muslim historian Al-Tabari, who informs us how Ardashir defeats and kills many other kings, some of whom were accorded divine attributes and worship, he says. These kings, and in one case queen, are pictured as horrible demonic monsters who tyrannize the population. No doubt this narrative derives from Sasanian propaganda. The explicit reference to these rulers receiving divine honors is extremely interesting in light of the Iranian belief in the divine radiance of legitimate rulers. And it's easy to see how ideas about the heavenly concept of the living king could lead to accusations of idolatry. But in reality, the claims of the Arsacid kings and their vassal kings were not so different from what the first Sasanian rulers propagated. Ardashir's foundation of fire temples for himself and his ancestors did not differ much from previous practices. The main difference was that it was now organized centrally. In my view, the evidence just listed proves that the religion of the Arsacid rulers is best interpreted within the context of Zoroastrian traditions. It's also clear that their dynastic cult inspired their vassal kings to erect similar monuments. We may now turn to my third and last point, the quest for the religious interaction with the local populations. It follows from the religious variety in the Arsacid Empire that, like the Achaemenid before them, the Arsacids did not force their own religious preferences upon their subjects. In fact, we even possess several instances testifying to their interaction with other cults and religions. Although this evidence is generally omitted from discussions on the possible Zoroastrian preferences of the Arsacid dynasty, such instances are telling with respect to their religious outlook and the way their Zoroastrianism was lived. The single most important source testifying to the interaction between Iranian and Greek and Mesopotamian religious traditions is the bronze statue in classical style of Heracles that was found in Seleucia on the Tigris in central Mesopotamia. The statue has a bilingual inscription in Greek and Parthian on its right and left leg, respectively. The Greek text informs us that at the end of the 2nd century, this statue of Heracles was forcibly removed by Vologases IV from Messene, and it was set up in the temple of Apollo in Seleucia. The Parthian text on the other leg refers to the statue as Viretrachna and notes that it was set up in the temple of Tyr. It's frequently assumed that originally Zoroastrian deities were not worshipped in human form. Anthropomorphic representations that were set up in enclosed shrines were only introduced during the Achaemenid period and really took off in the Seleucid and Parthian periods. Due to Greek influences, consequently, the iconography of Iranian deities was frequently inspired by Greek prototypes. Outside the Parthian Empire, in Asia Minor, representations of the Iranian goddess Anahita were indeed inspired by Greek iconography, that of Aphrodite. On Nemrudda in Commagene, the names of Greek and Iranian deities are combined to identify strongly Hellenized representations of various gods. And in the Arsacid Empire, representations of deities in Greek style and iconography have been found at the royal court in Nisa, as well as on coins from Seleucia. But apart from the Messene, Heracles, and the deities in Commagene, these Greek gods are never identified by inscriptions as Iranian deities, so it is not certain that they were interpreted as such. They may also have served as decoration, or perhaps were worshipped as foreign deities. It's therefore best to follow Michael Schenkar and avoid an interpretatio iranica of Greek-looking deities when explicit evidence is missing. It is indeed known that Arsacid rulers accepted and even participated in the cult of non-Iranian deities. Well known is the story told by Josephus in Antiquities about the two Jewish brothers, Asineus and Anileus, who briefly ruled over part of Babylonia with the consent of the Parthian king. Clearly, the religious denomination of these brothers did not keep the king from allying with them and providing them with the right to govern. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm going over time, I think. No, not yet. The Arsacid kings are also known to have taken an active part in the cult of foreign deities. It follows from the so-called astronomical diaries, dated to the 2nd and 1st centuries before the Common Era, that they sent their officials to the main traditional sanctuaries in Babylon to sacrifice to Babylonian gods. Now, hardly anything is known about the possible religious interaction between vassal kings and other associated rulers and their local populations. Given the multitude of non-Iranian gods and cults that are found here, there's no reason to think they forced their religious preferences on the local populations. The religious beliefs expressed by Antiochus I in the inscription of his funerary monument on Nemruda, for example, were probably not shared by most of his subjects. The Zoroastrian preferences of the Armenian kings, on the other hand, were leading for the local population. And in Hatra, the situation was even more complicated. Although the Hatrin king launched a dynastic ruler cult with a royal fire, it is by no means certain they adopted other Iranian religious practices as well. In any case, the religion of the local population was predominantly Semitic. But the reference to the royal god in the inscription Hatra 79 shows that Iranian concept had been incorporated in local religious practices. The fact that the Zoroastrianism of the Arsacid rulers and their minor kings was an inclusive religion, and that they accepted and interacted with the adherents of other cults and religions, shows that during this period, Zoroastrianism by and large functioned just like any other religion in antiquity. The claim of Albert de Jong that to followers of Zoroaster, their religion was a separate domain of culture cannot be maintained for most devotees during this period. The message of Zoroaster did not yet determine the way the Arsacids lived with their gods. And faith was not yet the decisive factor for determining the boundaries of their community. This may have been different outside Iran, for example, in Asia Minor, where they were a minority, but I think in Iran this was definitely not yet the case. It was certainly reintroduced or introduced during the Sasanian period, under the influence of other exclusive historical religions, such as Christianity, Manichaeism, and Buddhism. So before reaching my final conclusion, please bear with me for a couple of more minutes, I should say a few words on the definition of Zoroastrianism. I hope to have shown that, in a sense, the Arsacid rulers were followers of Zoroaster. Although not much is known about the religious practices of the Arsacids, it's clear from the little that we do know that in many respects it was at odds with normative Zoroastrianism as it is known today. But this manifestation of normative Zoroastrianism was largely developed during the Sasanian period. And not surprisingly, therefore, the Sasanian sources likewise accused the Arsacids of idol worship, religious fragmentation, and neglect. From this, scholars have concluded that the Arsacids were not yet real Zoroastrians, or only paid lip service to this religion. But in recent scholarship, there is a growing awareness of regional and historical varieties of Zoroastrian beliefs. Instead of departing from a stable Zoroastrian tradition that is based on two clusters of textual evidence, an early liturgical corpus in Avestan and a much later collection of priestly writings in Middle Persian, scholars now see Zoroastrian as a dynamic historical concept, characterized by variations with respect to gods worshipped, rituals performed, and narratives told. As was pointed out by the late Shaul Shaked, what is usually called Zoroastrianism in the pre-Islamic period was in fact a fairly large range of cult and worship, which is hardly capable of systematic treatment. I'm inclined to follow this view, since it fits much better with the heterogeneous religious situation that emerges from our sources. The main problem with this approach is that it becomes impossible to establish the boundaries of the religion. But what is clear is that the Sasanians thought of their Arsacid predecessors as people with many wrong religious practices and ideas. This strongly suggests the Arsacids were adherents of the same kind of religion as they were. After all, people of the same exclusive religions often fight most fiercely amongst themselves. Thank you for your attention.